Hello and welcome to the Disruptive Innovation Festival 2017. My name is Colin Webster and I'm your host for today's session. I'm part of the DIF team, and the DIF, the Disruptive Innovation Festival, launched yesterday to a global audience at our launch event in London, where we heard from 3 economists who told us what they think the economy might look like in the future. The Disruptive Innovation Festival, though, is a 3-week-long festival. Today, on the thinkdiff.co website, there are dozens of events, but over the course of 3 weeks, there will be hundreds of events that you can watch, which are either produced by us at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation or by a global audience who've asked to participate and present sessions at the Disruptive Innovation Festival. And today's session is one of those crowdsourced sessions that we'll be running. We're joined today by Ashwin, who comes from Gone Adventuring. Now, if you'd looked at our website, you might have noticed the name Laura Allen. Unfortunately, Laura is not well, but her business partner, Ashwin, is joining us for today's session, which is around talking about how we can drive the circular economy in Asia. Now, Ashwin and Laura with Gone Adventuring have worked in the field of sustainability for 6 years now. And for the last 3 years, they've started to focus on the circular economy. And what they're particularly been interested in, working with big companies across the continent, is looking at issues of waste, of food packaging, and of labeling. We're going to hear Ashwin talk about some of those problems that he's seen in Asia and some of the solutions that he's been working with some of those companies. But I'm going to pass over to Ashwin right now by asking him this question. Ashwin, well, first of all, thanks very much for joining us. But secondly, tell us this. Why do you think the circular economy is right for Asia?
Thanks very much, Colin, and everyone at DIF for the opportunity. It's a very good question. Why is circular economy essential for Asia? I'm just going to flick over very quickly to one of my slides to give you a very visual overview of why I think this is essential. Just give me a second. And there you go. This is what circular economy, or rather the lack of it, looks like here in Asia. One thing that you see a lot across many, many developing countries in Asia is huge landfills. Now, this is a photograph from a place called Bantar Gebang, which is it's located a few hours away from central Jakarta. So it's in this place called Bekasi, in the outskirts of Jakarta in Indonesia. And one thing that will strike you is there is a traffic jam in this photograph. And the traffic jam is the waste trucks that are lined up trying to put their waste inside. And this is the reality every day in this landfill. There is literally a queue of trucks that are waiting to put the waste in. And more than that, it's also the only functioning, or the only big functioning landfill here in this location in Jakarta. And we're seeing this reality across India, across Philippines, across Vietnam, Thailand, where mixed waste coming in from across households, across different parts of the industry, is all coming to these landfills and getting mixed up. So this is one of the realities which struck us quite consistently as we were doing our work 6 years back, and one of the main reasons which really inspired us to jump into this area of circular economy. So one other shocking statistic which inspires us and makes us wake up every day, which is that 8 of the top 10 countries which leak plastic into the oceans are located here in Asia. So you'll see the 8 over here. China is number 1. It puts out about 1,320 thousand tons of plastic marine debris, and this is a minimum estimate. Second is Indonesia, which puts out about 480,000 tons of plastic marine debris, and then Indonesia, and then Philippines and Vietnam, and so forth. And there's a few reasons for this, and some of these reasons I'll go through for the rest of the presentation. And what I would like to do through this brief presentation is introduce all of you, viewers and listeners across different parts of the world, to what this, what's so unique about Asia, and why are these challenges happening across many different countries, and also what are some of the solutions that are available and that are out there, and what we see as promising and investable in the future. So, as I mentioned to you about landfills, so one of the reports which came out by World Bank in 2012 talks about how there's going to be a 2 to 4 times growth in waste in Asia by 2025. So one of the main areas where the waste generation is going to grow is in Southeast Asia. So looking at Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, and also in India and China. And this is 2 to 4 times growth by 2025. But as you've seen in some of the images earlier, these countries are already struggling with the amount of waste that's coming in. So imagine what it's going to look like in just a few years' time when this amount of waste increases. A quick introduction to what we do as Adventurin. So our work is very much focused on the big area of circular economy, but in circular economy, we look at two main types of waste, as Colin mentioned. So one is on packaging waste and also on food waste. In the future, we will also be looking at electronics, but we've got our hands full with packaging and food right now here in Asia. And what we do in this area is 3 main things. So firstly, doing a lot of research and data collection on waste management. And the reason why we do this is because one thing we've found across many, many countries in Asia is that the data on household and commercial waste generation is either simply not available or it's completely outdated. So we're seeing governments and city governments using data which is as old as 10 years in their planning and in the city planning today. And in those 10 years, the waste composition has changed dramatically. So for instance, plastic waste or plastic in general is being consumed a lot more here in Asia today. But these sort of statistics, which are coming in from 2008, for example, so the last wide waste census in Indonesia was done in 2008, doesn't count this huge increase in plastics. So that's the reason why we spend a lot of the time doing research and data collection on different flows of plastics, of paperboard, as well as for food waste. The second area that we focus on is on designing and implementing projects on the ground. And often in Asia, one of the things we find is the devil is in the implementation. You can have some fantastic data and fantastic strategies, but at the end of the day, things have to work. So any circular economy projects or closing the loop projects where we're bringing in a few 100 or 1,000 tons of different materials back into manufacturing for a consumer goods or a packaging company has to be done through a pilot, and we have to find a way to figure out how do we solve those small problems that crop up all the time before we can try and make it big across the supply chain. The third area we focus on is on creating communications strategy and content, and I think this is very important because the awareness about circular economy or awareness even about segregating waste at homes here in Asia is very, very low. So there is a fundamental need to create behavior change and awareness, and that's where we're able to use some of our content and storytelling capabilities. So in our work over here in Asia, we have to work with multiple organizations. So we can't just choose to work with consumer goods companies or packaging companies. We have to work with governments. We have to work with international organizations and also with startups and media organizations. So which is why in our work here in Asia, you see an ecosystem of various collaborators that we're consistently working with. Now, what we believe in as Adventurin is the whole idea of circular economy. And I think this is very new as a topic. It's not something that's been in the forefront of people's minds. Waste and waste management is something which gets very little priority by the governments across Asia. And in people's minds, in the minds of the everyday citizens, waste is something you don't think about too much, right? It's just something that's thrown away. But the whole idea of circular economy, where you're really seeing waste as value, is something very new. But this is something which we bring out through all of our work consistently. And why is circular economy essential? So some of the really fantastic work that's come out of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has actually been able to quantify the value of the things that we're throwing away. So for example, about $80 to $120 billion worth of plastic packaging is being wasted each year. And many of these are single-use packaging. So things that we would use maybe once or maximum 2 times, and it gets chucked away. And there's also some other really good infographics by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which shows the amount of time different plastic materials can be in the environment. So for example, a plastic bottle can be in the environment for as long as 400, 500 years. Same for a diaper. So Quantifying that value has, in our opinion, created a lot of incentive for businesses to start looking at into this area seriously. One of the other reports, or one of the other sort of infographics that's come out of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is looking at where is all of this waste actually going out. And again, bringing it back to plastics, we see that about 32% of packaging that's being produced each year is going directly into the open environment. 40% is going into landfills. But as you have seen in some of the photographs earlier, landfills in Asia are essentially glorified dump sites. There's very little sanitary landfills that are being either started or run on a very good basis, and especially I'm talking about developing countries. Of course, in developed Asian countries like Japan or Singapore, you do have much better landfill facilities and sanitary landfills. But for the large part in developing countries in Asia, unfortunately, landfills essentially, or the waste in landfills is still being leaked into the environment. And very little plastic packaging is actually coming back into manufacturing. We talked about plastic waste, but food waste is actually also a very important challenge. And one of the reasons for that is the rising affluence. So Asia is definitely an economic growth story. I think in the last 10 to 15 years, several countries in Asia have posted some fantastic economic growth. But the downside of that economic growth is also the waste. And one of the big things that we're seeing over here in Asia is also the cultural issues associated with food waste. So for instance, it's acceptable in some parts of Asia to leave a little bit of rice on your plate before you walk away from the table. Because it's supposed to show abundance. It's supposed to show prosperity. So we're also looking at cultural issues while we're talking about the bigger issue of waste. Now, I wanted to do a bit of a numbers example, just so that we can bring some of these challenges that we are facing in Asia into perspective. So one main challenge that we're seeing across Asia is the lack of funding that's being put into waste management, and especially into the recycling infrastructure. So one of the, and as part of our work, we do a lot of research and data collection. And one of the interesting things that we found out is that in the case of Indonesia, the amount of money that the government would be spending on waste management per year is to the tune of about 200 million euros. Of course, some of the information, some of the government data is not easily accessible, but this is the information that we have found based on what is publicly available. But we estimate that it would be around 200, maximum about 400 to 500 million euros that the Indonesian government would be spending. However, if you look at the United Nations Environment Programme and the International Solid Waste Management Association, they expect developing countries to spend about 1% of their gross national income on waste management if the waste collection rates need to increase over 95%. So if you put some of those numbers back for Indonesia, the money that they would need to be spending to collect their waste would be to the tune of 7.6 billion euros per year. So there you go. That's a stark difference that's in the funding that's going into waste management that's clearly visible. One other interesting one other interesting figure that we found out is, the amount of money that's going into communications, especially about recycling. Now, if you look at some of the numbers from the Indonesian government, they will be currently spending about 40 million euros on communicating to the population about the need for recycling. However, just one company in Indonesia would have an annual marketing budget about 10 times that. And in Indonesia, we're talking about maybe 10 or 15 large consumer goods companies. So it's really no surprise that the awareness of recycling is just not there. One of the other main challenges here in Asia is missing infrastructure. Now I'll touch a little bit upon India. So India currently has 5 mega cities. So these are basically cities with a population of more than 10 million. Now by 2050, that's going to increase to 7 mega cities. And on top of that, if you look at the total numbers, that's going to be about 300 million urban residents in India. So just in the next 20 or 30 odd years, there's going to be a significant increase in urban population, but at the same time, there is not enough infrastructure investments that being put into waste management. There is a lot of money that's going into, say, building highways, into maybe building schools, but very little that's really going into waste management. The other issue that we're seeing is also in the amount of recycling infrastructure that's being built. And here I'll go into Philippines. So to give you a sense of what's actually happening right now in the Philippines, if you were to look at the materials recovery facilities, so these are basically community level segregation centers, and this is a requirement by law. So back in 2000, the government of the Philippines put in effect a law which required that each community needs to have a MRF, or materials recovery facility. However, after almost 17 years of the law being existing, the coverage of materials recovery facility in Metro Manila, which is by far the economic engine and one of the most populous parts of the Philippines, is only at 56%. So there's simply not enough recycling infrastructure that has been built.
Can I, Ashwin, sorry, can I just come in and ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
And that actually reminds me to ask the audience too, if they want to put questions in, you can do so on the thinkdiff.co page. You might be watching this in, or on the YouTube page, and we'll make sure that the questions will get to Ashwin. But the question I wanted to ask was, whose responsibility is it in the Philippines for these community material recovery facilities? Is it the equivalent of the local authority, or is there some expectation that corporations might have to be asked to chip in to materials recovery?
Yeah, good question. So a lot of the weight of the legislation actually falls on local government units. So these are basically at the city levels. So the city level mayors, or even if you look at the further one level down from the city, so it's the barangays, which is basically the smallest government unit, which is within the city. So a lot of the weight of establishing some of these materials recovery facility falls on these barangays and on city mayors. So that's where the bulk of the responsibility lies. Does that answer your question, Colin?
Yeah, sorry, I was muted there. Yes, it does. Thanks very much.
Okay, no worries. All right, I'll keep it going, and please keep the questions coming in the meantime. So one of the other challenges I want to touch upon is the lack of existing regulations. Now, I put a complicated sort of diagram over there just to highlight the point that regulations do exist. So as you can see, this is the flow chart for regulations in Indonesia. There's about 4 or 5 major regulations, starting with the law 18-2008, which governs waste management in Indonesia, and there's many other laws under that. And on top of that, there is laws being enacted at city levels within Indonesia. However, the biggest challenge that remains in most developing countries in Asia is the enforcement of these laws, where the national level regulation framework exists. However, at the city level or at the community level, where there's a lot of power that's been devolved to put waste management policies in place. And again, back to Colin's question of where does the weight of the responsibility lie? In most Asian countries, it lies in the local government unit, which is the cities. But at the city level, we are seeing either those sorts of regulations don't exist, or they're just not being enforced at all. One of the other interesting things we find is in Asia is that there's a huge informal sector working in waste management. Now, earlier I showed you a photograph of Bantar Gebang, which is the landfill in Indonesia. If you were to really zoom in, what you'll see is that an entire army of waste pickers who are working on the landfill. So if you look at that red box, there's about 10 waste workers or waste pickers or scavengers, as we call it, in the landfill. And in fact, in the entire landfill, there's anywhere between 2,000 to 5,000 of these waste pickers going in every day to collect different materials. And often, these waste workers don't have any protective equipment, and they have no access to any sort of health insurance schemes. And these are people who are doing a very, very important job in keeping, first of all, the city and the landfill clean, taking out what is valuable, and making sure it hits the recyclers. And unfortunately, they're completely not part of the economic system today. And even though the informal sector is largely uneducated, there are pockets where we are now seeing a shift where some of these informal sectors now being formalized by the city governments, and I'll touch upon that in a little bit. So we looked at some of the challenges, and I also now want to highlight to you what are some of the good examples that are happening. So coming back to Indonesia, one example that we really like and that's come across over the last few years is the city of Depok, which has and is one of the first cities in Indonesia to first of all create a city-level regulation on source segregation of waste, which means households who don't segregate the waste into 2 or 3 bins will not have the waste collected. And it was one of the first cities in Indonesia to put in force this regulation. But what's also interesting is that Depok was brave enough, the city officials in Depok were brave enough to enforce these regulations. So the head of the sanitation agency a few years back, basically told the households that if you're not going to segregate, I'm not going to pick it up. Initially, the household said, yeah, right, we will continue not to segregate. But he, true to his word, did not collect. And within a few days, the households were calling in and were telling him that, okay, we'll start segregating. Please come and collect the waste. And it's this sort of a city level, courage that we see has helped really transform the waste management sector here in Depok. And that's also ensuring that a lot of the materials, because you have organic waste and other recyclables that are being segregated, it's ensuring that there's maximum value that's being created. So as we saw earlier, there's the technical materials and the biological materials are getting segregated, and the city is able to extract maximum value out of its waste. One other example which is really interesting from a regulatory point of view is the idea of extended producer responsibility. Now, this is something which started out of mostly in European countries, the idea of EPR, as we call it, where the government typically puts in place a regulation requesting or requiring the packaging companies or any companies which produce materials, for example, electronics or plastics, to take the responsibility of taking back their own waste. And what's interesting here in Japan is that there is a clear regulation that's existed for many years, and they also have a very transparent way of calculating how to put a price on the materials. So one of the interesting things you'll notice in this sort of formula is in the top formula, in the pink box, it says the portion your company collects itself. And what this means is that when the recycling fee that the company has to pay to the government gets calculated, if the company has its own programs to collect back its waste from the consumers, then the amount of money that they have to pay actually gets reduced. So by law, they are incentivizing, as in Japan is incentivizing companies to take care of their own packaging materials and to bring it back. And in our opinion, this is a very good example of extended producer responsibility, because it's really making it voluntary for companies, or it's encouraging voluntary collection of materials. And at the same time, it's also putting in place a fee which is estimated in a very transparent basis. One of the examples that we've seen in some other parts of Europe is that many of these sorts of EPR schemes actually run independently of the government, which means it's not a tax, it's actually a fee that the companies, the consumer goods or packaging companies pay to an industry body, and the industry body goes and puts in place the systems to take care of the packaging materials. For the informal sector, there's really good examples from Bangalore, where there's about anywhere between 10 to 30,000 informal sector people who are working in waste management. And the city a few years ago decided to formalize this informal sector. So one of the things they did is they started giving ID cards and vests where anyone who's working in the waste sector can easily be recognized. So as you can see in the photograph on the left, this is an all-women team, and these group of women and also all the waste pickers are now given protective equipment. So when they go and pick up waste from the households, they can be ensured that they have the right sort of safety standards in place. And on top of that, they're also given access to finance and insurance schemes. One other really good example from Bangalore in India is the idea of micro-entrepreneurs. So a lot of these waste pickers who until a few years ago were literally out on the streets by themselves are now given the opportunity to manage their own little, small recycling shops within the dry waste collection centers, which are basically government-built infrastructure across the wards in the city of Bangalore. Now, coming back to plastics, one of the things that we see is going to be quite critical here in Asia is, as the Ellen MacArthur Foundation talks about, which is the focus on design. So, unfortunately, a lot of the packaging, especially the flexible packaging that we see here in Asia, is made out of many, many materials. So we have multi-material packaging, which the average waste picker who has no access to high-tech tools to separate the aluminium and the plastic and the paperboard is able to work on. So designing for recyclability is going to be critical to ensure we can drive circular economy for packaging, especially for plastics. The second area of focus is the idea of alternative delivery systems. So today, if you look at a typical Asian city, and if you go to some of these small shops, you'll see plenty of these small sachets hanging from the shops. And this idea of sachets was invented way before the impact of waste became evident. And I think as we as a society become more aware about the lack of recyclability of some of these items, I think there are companies that are beginning to focus on the idea of alternative delivery systems. So how do we get the same materials out to the consumers, especially in developing Asia, in such a way that we can really reduce the need for even having a lot of packaging in the first place? The third area of focus is going to be creating partnerships with cities. So as I mentioned earlier, the example of the POC, at the end of the day, the fight towards driving circular economy, especially in the area of waste management, is going to be won at the city level. So it's going to be extremely important for any packaging companies or consumer goods companies or food waste companies to be able to partner with city governments to drive segregation and also to be able to buy back the materials, because it ensures, first of all, consistency, and it also ensures quality of the materials that they can get back. Now, one thing that you would find quite a lot, at least recently, is that there's been announcements of how companies are working on making their packaging made out of beach plastic. And I think this is a very good initiative. It's definitely heading in the right direction. However, there is a huge need for focus on stopping the leak at source. So I think collecting beach plastic and ocean plastic will only get us so far. We have to also work on initiatives at the city level and making sure that we are plugging the leak from urban bodies. And one other area of focus is also increasing the demand for recycled content, where just putting a label about, please recycle is not going to be enough. We are seeing companies increasingly committing to increase the amount of recycled plastic in the packaging. So for instance, Unilever has recently committed to increase the amount of recycled content to at least 25% by 2025. We're also seeing companies like Coca-Cola pledge to increase the amount of recycled materials in their packaging. So these are the kind of initiatives that are going to be critical if we are to really create a societal change or a change across the economic value chain. One other area that we find really interesting is also the use of 100% recycled content. So here's a great example from the UK called Pentatonic, and this company was started in partnership with a Taiwanese company. It was partly funded by an Asian organization, which is looking at creating really high-end furniture made out of 100% trash. And I think this is the kind of initiatives that are going to really be game-changing, because they're fundamentally changing the notion of waste, where they're saying everything that goes out of your bin is valuable. And in fact, it's in fact a new business opportunity. So with that, I just want to end the presentation. I'll be opening up to questions. I just want to say that while this sort of reality in Asia can often be quite depressing, as you might have seen in the initial photographs, going into landfills, which we do very often every time we go to a city, it can be quite sad. But at the same time, there's lots of optimism. There are, there's an opportunity to literally lift millions of people out of poverty. At the same time, there is an opportunity to fundamentally change supply chains by looking at increasing the amount of recycled content. So with that, I'll hand it back to Colin, and I'll take some questions.
Thanks very much for that, Ashwin. That was a whirlwind tour of some of the huge waste problems that many Asian countries are facing. And you outlined the problem, I think, really well, Ashwin. We did get a question in I want to ask you just now, and we've got time for maybe a couple right now. So if anyone's got a question they really want to fire into us, please do so on the ThinkDiff website or through the page on YouTube if you happen to be watching it there. The question came in from Alex, and he said, I've got it down here. All right, you talked about how quantifying the value creates incentive for businesses to act differently. So the question was, what do you tell these businesses? How do they react? And are there any success stories?
Yeah. So quantifying, as I mentioned, quantifying is very critical. And I think what we are seeing right now in most parts of Asia is that the amount of, let's look at, say, plastic PET, right, which is a packaging product which is very much recyclable and can be used back into packaging. There is really no good information out there on what's happening to these plastics in different markets in Asia. So that's the first thing that we tell when we work with companies is let's go and quantify what is happening to these plastics. Where is it going? Who's paying money for it? And what is the end use? So then we can find out how do we put the right sort of interventions in place to make sure that we're actually creating closed loop. And one thing that's really interesting, which happened recently, is the ban by China on importing a lot of different types of waste. So that's significantly impacted the recycling sector in many parts of the world, and including here in Asia. But in my opinion, those sorts of initiatives are actually great because it's going to increase the investment that's going to go into the recycling and the waste management sector here in Asia. We're really going to have to focus on making sure that a lot of these materials get dealt with locally. So I think these are the kind of initiatives that will be quite critical to make sure that companies can maximize the value.
Okay, super. Thank you very much. We had another question in from Jen, who asked about Japan's way of incentivizing feedback. You showed us a slide which demonstrated how much companies are charged, I think it was, depending on how much packaging they use. Her question was about what they use, perishable packaging. Might that lead to negative feedback on this model where Japanese companies are fined, or rather they're rewarded for bringing back packaging? But what if they don't bring it back, is her point. What if it's perishable in a healthful way for the system?
Yeah, I think that touches on a very good question about bioplastics, where we are seeing a lot of movement over here in Asia. I think it's very easy for the typical, maybe even the government officials or the average citizen to understand that, bioplastics means waste is taken care of, right? But that's not quite true, because for bioplastics to really degrade, you need 100% biodegradable plastics. Often, bottles which claim to be bioplastics are actually not bioplastics 100%. They're only 25% bioplastics. 75% is still chemical polymers. And also, you need the right sort of conditions to make sure it can actually degrade. So a bioplastic is not going to degrade out in the landfill, that's what you saw earlier. So I think if the right conditions are there to make sure that these bioplastics can degrade and it can be proven and audited on a weekly basis or on a yearly basis, I think that would be the right sort of incentive to companies to then reduce the amount of fees that they would have to pay, and it also encourage investment into bioplastics.
Okay, super. And I'm going to ask you one final question. You've outlined a large problem. What one thing gives you hope that the waste problem in Asia can be minimized?
Yeah, one thing which gives us a lot of hope is there's a huge movement both among the companies, so the packaging companies, consumer goods companies, retail chains, as well as at the government level. There's an acknowledgement that waste is a problem, and we shouldn't have to deal with this problem, because if we can establish the right sort of circular systems, then it's actually going to be an opportunity. It's going to be an economic opportunity. It's going to be an environmental opportunity. So we're definitely seeing a huge movement just in the last 1 year compared to just a few years ago when we started getting into this reality. So I think that gives us a lot of optimism that things will change. And also the fact that young people are getting really into it. So we often travel to Indonesia and India, and we see people, both boys and girls with fantastic engineering, science, and business degrees are getting into waste management. I think this is the kind of future that we want to live into, where this becomes an exciting industry to work in.
Okay, so I think on that positive note, I'm going to say thank you very much to Ashwin Subramania for joining us almost at the last minute for today's session after his colleague took unwell. So thank you so much, Ashwin, for that, that introduction to some of the big problems that are faced in Asia as you're trying to incentivize or tackle a waste problem and incentivize a switch to something a bit more circular. So thank you so much for giving up your time today and joining us from Singapore. And that reminds me that we do have people joining us from all around the world over these 3 weeks during the Disruptive Innovation Festival. If you go to thinkdiff.co, you'll see a wealth of different sessions that are coming up today and over the next 3 weeks. For example, just to pick out a couple from today, in about 20 minutes time, there's one about a post-disposable future, which no doubt has some relevance to the session that we've just heard here with Ashwin. Let me tell you also at 12:30 we'll be in the live studio, our first time in the live studio today, where we'll be launching the Circular Economy playlist. So this is for people who want to learn more about the circular economy and really get to grips with what it's all about. We've curated a whole bunch of sessions and activities that you can participate in so that you get to understand a bit more about what a circular economy actually is. And one final one I want to tell you that I'm really looking forward to is at 1 o'clock today, can platform co-ops fix the sharing economy? That's with Trebor Schultz. I read an article of his a few months ago. It was a really fascinating read. And this idea of platform co-ops is one that certainly fascinates me. And I know the chap who interviewed him says this is a terrific talk. So do tune in and watch that one at 1 p.m. But there's hundreds more at thinkdiff.co. So please head there and check out something that's of interest to you, or join in the conversation at #ThinkDiff on Twitter. But for now, that's all from me, Colin Webster. And thanks again, Ashwin, for joining us with that talk. It's goodbye for now. Goodbye.